Hello, I'm Dr. Eric Michaels of the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics in the College of Agriculture and Bioresources at the University of Saskatchewan here in Saskatoon. Today, our Market Prospects 2018 guest is Dr. Chad Lawley, Associate Professor in the Department of Agribusiness and Agricultural Economics at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Dr. Lawley is here in our department to present a seminar on his research into the effect of ownership restrictions on farmland values. We are pleased that he has found the time to also have a conversation about this research for our Market Prospects audience. Welcome, Dr. Lawley.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Just to start off, could what got you interested in this issue of ownership restrictions on farmland?
Good, yeah. So a lot of my prior research has looked at issues of, farmland restrictions and easements purchased by conservation groups. So I'm based out of Manitoba, but grew up in Saskatchewan. I started observing discussions in about 2015 about this entry of institutional investors into the province due to the amendments in 2003, and so I got interested in the economic implications of that amendment. And there were a lot of stories about institutional investors coming in and increasing land values, and I thought I'd have the tools to sort of assess this, and thought it'd be interesting to have a look.
There's been some research around this space, since you mentioned the amendments in the '03 Act. There's a paper by Magnan and Desmarais that talked about a lot of these arm's length transactions were purchased by these institutional investors, and there was like this run up after that, and that kind of you always kind of heard about it. It was coffee shop talk and whatnot of all these institutional investors bidding up the price of land or actually winning the bid and actually acquiring it.
Right. Yeah, and that's sort of what we'd expect. You sort of open up the province to outside capital. That capital, presumably should come in and would start bidding up the price of land. I was an MSc student in this department, 2002 through 2004, and at that time, Hartley Furtan and one of my colleagues, Sean Ferguson, were looking into pending farmland amendments, and so they could look at sort of historical impact of the early amendments. It was interesting, stepping back a few years. Now we could sort of see that some of the concerns about increases in farmland values were potentially happening.
Yeah, like you say, you open that up and you have these institutional investors who are looking at correlations of different asset classes. They're buying this, trying to buy this land because it works for them in a portfolio sense, and maybe from following the sage advice of Warren Buffett, they see farmland as gold with a dividend, as opposed to they see it as that play, and that maybe drives some of their decisions to get into that market.
Yeah, that's right. And I think historically, so these farmland ownership restrictions came into North America probably in the 70s and 80s at a time of high land values. So many states in the U.S. and then the Prairie provinces in Canada introduced these restrictions. My impression is that at that time there were concerns about increasing farmland values and inability of the next generation of farmers to sort of get into the market. So it's interesting that a lot of the concerns about outside investment and even Manitoba were occurring once again at a time of high land values.
Yeah. So you talked about different restrictions in U.S. states and other prairie provinces. How are those restrictions, or what are some of the characteristics of those restrictions in those jurisdictions?
Yeah, so there are different types. So many of the restrictions are just a restriction on foreign ownership. And so if you're in a U.S. state or say in Manitoba, a Canadian resident can buy Manitoba farmland, but a U.S. or a European resident would not be able to. There's also sort of restrictions on corporate ownership of farmland, and so North Dakota, as an example, had one of the, to my knowledge, one of the earlier pieces of legislation. So in the 1930s, there was this Depression era legislation that came into place. There were a lot of farm foreclosures. My impression is that some of that land was going into sort of corporate entities, and there was a concern that farmland was out of the hands of the farmers, and so they introduced this legislation, and that's amazingly that's persisted to now, and they just recently had a referendum on the topic, and there's the same constraint on corporate ownership of farmland in North Dakota. Saskatchewan introduced fairly restrictive legislation in 1974, and so rather than restricting ownership to Canadian residents, it was restricted to just Saskatchewan residents.
And that restriction, it wasn't just for farmers, any Saskatchewan resident.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you talk about the 74 legislation, then you have the change in 03. What was that change?
Yeah, so in 2003, I guess January 1st, 2003, the legislation was the Saskatchewan Farm Security Act was amended to allow Canadian residents and I guess sort of agricultural corporations to buy Saskatchewan farmland. So that 2003 legislation opened up to investment from across Canada.
Okay, so then in some of that other work in this area, they looked at transactional data and said, yeah, the legislation had its intended effect. I guess these other investors actually came in and were buying farmland.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting reading there was a Standing Committee on Agriculture report from I think June of 2002, leading up to the amendment. There was some talk about it, this sort of restrictive legislation depressing land prices. This was a time of low land prices in Saskatchewan, sort of stagnant farming sector to some extent. There was a lot of talk that this legislation probably wouldn't lead to a big increase in farmland values. So I don't think this influx of new capital was necessarily perfectly foreseen.
Okay.
Although some people did see that for sure. There wasn't a notion that a lot of the investment would probably come from Europe.
So was Saskatchewan farmland at that time, would you say it was undervalued relative to farmland in Manitoba or Alberta or other agricultural locations?
Yeah, so my research certainly indicates that was the case. So my research looks at Saskatchewan farmland sort of before the amendment in 2003 and then after, and I use similar farmland in Manitoba to sort of assess the impact of this amendment, and it looks like that was the case. So my results suggest that prior to the amendment, Saskatchewan farmland values were sort of losing ground to Manitoba farmland values. I think Manitoba farmland values were increasing at the time, and Saskatchewan land values had sort of been in a period of stagnation, at least in real terms.
So this brings us to kind of the question you have and your results. So can you talk about what your main results that you found in your study?
Yeah, sure. So I looked at a sample of land transactions in Manitoba and Saskatchewan spanning 1995 through 2010. So I sort of have this 8-year window on the other side of the amendment, and I'm using Manitoba as this sort of control, if you want to think of it in that way. So I find the impact of the 2003 amendment is to increase Saskatchewan farmland values by between 2 and 3% per year, and that so cumulatively over the first 8 years after the amendment, that adds up to a pretty significant increase in property values and the farmland values in the province.
Which is good if you're looking to retire and you're looking to maybe sell that. If you don't have a son or daughter to pass that land off to, that I would like higher land values or higher asset values if I'm exiting the industry. But I guess you worry about the other side too. The beginning farmers makes it more expensive for them to get in. Is that kind of the crux of these policy debates? Or
I think so, yeah. And so we can look back at the historical record. And so there was a special committee on agriculture report in '73, then the standing committee report in 2002, and then the most recent 2015 public consultation that the government of Saskatchewan carried out. And this theme of reducing competition for farmland and helping young farmers to get a start in the market in the business is prevalent in all three of those documents. But you're right. At the same time, if you're a retiring farmer, not necessarily passing on that land to a family relation, you want to be able to sell to the highest bidder in most cases, right? So,
yeah.
So this opened that up, and you could certainly look at the amendment as being a transfer of a significant amount of cash to or farmland value to anyone who owned farmland in 2003.
So in terms of we think of this as a really nice piece that you had published in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, and could there's other things that can go on from that. But for like the lay audience, the farmer audience, what's the main takeaway that they could take from that piece?
Yeah, so I guess the focus of that study was to do a careful job, assessing the impact of this amendment and this new outside capital on farmland values, so we can see sort of anecdotal evidence that it might be occurring, and it sort of is intuitive that it would happen. But I tried to do a careful job of getting that number pretty precise.
If I could just jump in,
sure.
You tried to control for in that part of your study area, you have the Bakken, you have all of these other factors that might be driving land values, and you account for those as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I took some care to. So obviously, the Bakken oil play development occurred in roughly 2006, and so that could be conflating this effect of the amendment on property values. So I took some steps to account for that. So I reran the models with that region excluded, and the results persisted. Naturally, you'd also be concerned about differential sort of farmland or cash receipts in the two provinces, and so Manitoba had this development of the hog sector and the potato sector sort of pre-amendment, and then there's some stagnation afterwards. So maybe the catch-up in Saskatchewan is due to that.
Right, and that would account for we typically think of asset values as a capitalization value based on these receipts, and so you're accounting for that. You're saying, okay, there's some income from potatoes or hogs or whatever, and you're trying to adjust or control for those different factors. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I had the advantage, so more recently this land transaction data has become available, and so I had access to actual sales in Saskatchewan, actual sales in Manitoba, and so I could account for characteristics of the farmland. I could do a nice job of that, and then knowing where these farmland sales are located allowed me to think about geographic factors that would be influencing farmland values. So it's nice. I had great data at my disposal that really wasn't available to earlier researchers, for sure.
And it's always a great thing to have access to some really nice data, and then with a good question. You have the question, you get access to the data, and you can run with it.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It was a good.
Well, Chad, I appreciate you taking the time to be with us in this Market Prospects interview. Really enjoyed reading the paper and enjoyed following you in your research that you've been conducting at the University of Manitoba. So thank you for providing this interview today. I'm Dr. Eric Michaels, and this has been Market Prospects 2018.